So, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Mistra Dialogue-webinar. The webinar will be on how you can identify knowledge or research gaps with a special emphasis on biodiversity and insects. We will present and discuss the study InsectGapMap, and I'm glad so many have signed up for this webinar. My name is Thomas Nilsson, and I'm Programs Director at Mistra. I'm also in charge of, but with great support from my colleagues, our internal process to identify potential areas for Mistra's next generation of research programs. I will very briefly introduce the webinar before I hand over to our invited speakers. First, a few words about Mistra. Mistra is an independent foundation that funds environmental research of strategic importance for society. We focus on complex problems which often require cross-sectorial and transdisciplinary approaches. That means that most often stakeholders are involved and engaged from the very beginning of our research programs. There are currently about 20 Mistra research programs running, covering many of the environmental and sustainable development challenges facing society. This webinar is part of Mistra's process for developing new research programs. Biodiversity is a very timely topic to consider. Despite all efforts, or because of a lack of efforts, the threats against biodiversity are many and to a large extent a consequence of human activities. There are about 1 million insect species in the world described that we know of. There might be many more. This means that the number of insect species probably are more than the number of all other species. So there are good reasons to focus on insects as we have done in this study. But it was also, and maybe more important, a way to delimit the study and make the job easier for the analysts. Although the study is on insects, we believe that many of the conclusions about research gaps and policy needs are relevant much broader and for biodiversity conservation in general. Another reason we commissioned this study was to evaluate if the method or tool used, which is based on systematic reviews, is useful for us when exploring new areas and preparing calls, also in other areas than biodiversity. We will start this webinar with Neal Haddaway presenting the study. After that, 3 other experts, Swedish experts, namely Magnus Land, Marie Stensäcke, and Per Sjögren Gulve, will be giving the opportunity to comment on the study and its conclusions. I will introduce these 3 experts later on. Finally, there will be time for questions and comments from the audience. Click the Q&A at the bottom of the screen and enter your question if you have any. First then, I'd like to introduce Neal Haddaway. Hello, Neal. You are one of the authors of the report. Your co-author, Eliza, University of Connecticut, couldn't make it today, unfortunately. She is finishing her dissertation these days. But you have done the analysis in the study together. Very short about Neal. He's a senior research fellow at the Stockholm Environment Institute here in Stockholm and a senior researcher at the Mercator Research Institute on Global Commons and Climate Change in Berlin, where we are now, I think. He works on various projects involving evidence synthesis in environmental and development topics. Neal's main research interest focuses on the provision of reliable evidence for policy and practice decision-making and increasing transparency in environmental management. He has a PhD in conservation biology. Please, Neal.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Thomas. I'm really excited to be here. I'm in Sweden at the moment, actually. But yeah, congratulations on pronouncing the name of the Mercator Research Institute. It's quite a mouthful. So yeah, with that excellent introduction, I can dive straight in. The topic I'm going to be talking to you about is quite complicated. It has quite strong backbone of coding and methodology behind it. So I'll try to cover as much as I can in the short time I have. But more details are provided in the report that's available on the Mistra website and will be circulated and are available in more detail on the website that I'll share as well. If you'd like to tweet this talk, please feel free. My Twitter handle is Neal Haddaway. And before I started, I wanted to just share some acknowledgements. Firstly, thanks to Mistra for the very generous funding and the opportunity to conduct this work, which is something I'm really excited about. Thanks also to Eliza Grames, who's the picture on the top right of your screen. Eliza is the expert behind the coding part of the project and has put a huge amount of work into the coding behind this. So thanks to Eliza. And thanks to the InterGem project, which is a project that Eliza runs looking at mapping evidence on insect populations more broadly. And you can find out more about that at the InterGem website. And finally, thanks to the 4 people who helped out during the review of reviews, which I'll highlight in a bit as well. So without further ado, the background to this project, as Thomas has introduced, is that we wanted to know, often funders want to know what we know about a research topic, particularly which subtopics might warrant further primary research. So where are the knowledge gaps? And also, do these really warrant research? Are they sensible gaps? And often the approach that we might suggest, or that I might suggest, would be systematic mapping. A type of very rigorous evidence synthesis that systematically identifies the nature of an evidence base, the gaps and the clusters. But this is very time consuming. It is an expensive process and it requires a lot of resources and careful planning because it gives a very rigorous, very comprehensive answer. But if we're asking where the gaps are, sometimes we don't need to be quite so rigorous and comprehensive with this analysis. So we wanted to know what we could do with text analysis and expert opinion, but learning from systematic mapping methods to make use of computational methods to be as rigorous as possible within the constraints that we have. We also wanted to produce a tool that was incrementally refinable. And what I mean there is that we do an initial mapping and exploration of an evidence base, and by putting a little bit more effort, we can improve the comprehensiveness and reliability of our understanding of that topic. Hopefully that will become a little bit clearer as I go. So the approach that we've decided to use was to combine 3 different types of methods. Firstly, starting with what we call a review of reviews. And this is basically a mapping of all of the literature reviews that exist on the topic, in this case, insect conservation actions, and look at which actions they refer to. And our theory here is that literature reviews will be a good indication of what interventions are available in the underlying literature without actually having to read that literature in full. And on top of that review of reviews, we wanted to build an ontology. By ontology, I mean a rich descriptive dictionary that links different terms together. And in this case, we wanted to build an ontology of insect conservation actions. So you might imagine that there are different types of actions. One might be educating people about the value of insects. Another might be buffer strips around fields to improve habitat for insects. And some of those actions will be more closely related to each other based on the type of action and the type of system that they are used in. So that ontology is like a taxonomy of different interventions and how they relate to one another. We then wanted to apply this ontology in something called topic modeling, where we obtain a very large literature, and based on the abstracts and the titles of all of the records that we can find from searching a very broad literature, we wanted to automatically try to identify which topics were more studied than others and where there might be gaps. So just before diving in, I wanted to share some limitations and strengths of the project as I see it. Firstly, the data that we're analyzing here is solely research literature that's been published in academic sources and in some cases theses. We don't, unlike in systematic reviews and systematic maps, include searches for grey literature. It's a time-consuming process, and what we're trying to do here is an initial mapping that is very rapid. So we don't include things like organizational reports, consultancy reports, or government papers. But the strengths of this project, as I see it, are that we're basing the initial work on a project that I introduced earlier called the InterGem project, which is an existing project where there's been extensive systematic searching across lots of research literature. And I'll explain a little bit more about where the evidence that we're using comes from. So it's built on a very extensive curated evidence base that relates to insect populations. Another strength is that we've combined the automatic approach of text analysis with expert insights, so that we're able to combine a detailed conversation with experts with some of the more automated processes that might do what we want, but might also be very strictly applied and might make some what we would call mistakes. So by combining the two, we're able to be much stronger than just one. We also think that this is a really strong basis for a future full systematic review or even systematic map. So we're able to identify where there are enough studies that a full systematic review might be feasible, rather than launching into a systematic review and finding that there aren't enough studies. So we also think that's a strength. We also feel that I'll introduce the iterative semi-supervised topic modeling, which is a very complex term. It's essentially a set of models that we build can be continually retrained and continually improved as we provide it more information and more training. So what we've built doesn't need to be done from scratch. It's a computer model that's essentially learning as we give it more. And then the final strength is that we have multiple outputs from this project, and we feel there's a very strong legacy. One is that we've done a review of all literature reviews on insect conservation actions. We've built an ontology of how the existing literature categorizes and describes insect conservation actions. We've built a network of researchers as well by assembling a group of experts together. We've performed the main topic of this presentation, the gap analysis, where the gaps in the research are. And we've also produced, or Eliza has produced, an open source script that can be applied in any topic. It's discipline agnostic, as I'll show you. So I promised to introduce InterGem. InterGem, you can find out more at entergem.github.io, the website. It's a project to map all insect population decline or change or increase literature. So all the literature looking at insect populations. Eliza has assembled a database of over 144,000 search results. And so far, more than 7,000 articles have been screened manually. There are 27 people in the project, and this shows where that evidence comes from. Specifically for this project, we have subsetted a search within the InterGem database to look for any conservation action literature. So we've used this search string that Eliza developed using her LitSearcher search string development package. And we ended up with over 40,000 potentially relevant articles that seem to be dealing with insect conservation actions. Another thing that Eliza did was to build a web scraping tool to pull in conservation actions that have been painstakingly already listed in some of the projects conducted by the Conservation Evidence Group. And you can see more about what their group does at conservationevidence.org. But essentially, it's a service that's provided to practitioners where they can come and see all possible actions that they can take to try to conserve a system or a habitat. And you can see some examples of the categories and the conservation actions that they've assembled. Some of these, like bee conservation and farmland conservation, are either directly about insects or contain information about insects. So Eliza was able to pull out information from the website that dealt with those actions. So we used those and put them alongside the actions that we pulled out of the review of reviews. And that review of reviews is a project that identified separately 9,000 articles that seemed to be about insect conservation and were some form of literature review. And the team went through and identified a large number of conservation actions from the abstracts, and we'll carry on and write this up as a full systematic review of reviews. But essentially that gave us a long list of actions that we could then try to build an ontology from. And so we planned our expert workshop. We assembled 42 entomologists, insect experts from across the world. Although there was a bias towards the UK, the US, and Australia, we did get experts from a number of other countries, with several experts from low and middle income countries, which is great. But we wanted to have this long list of actions that we pulled from the literature and then assemble this dictionary, a sort of thesaurus of conservation actions. And this is what the thesaurus looks like. It's available online. And you can see there that we've clustered those as several different expert groups working across topics and then again working together under things like education and awareness, communication with the public, and comprehensive educational campaigns about conservation. So you can see those are 3 different layers of actions and strategies that we've clustered together. And in terms of the analysis of the literature, we used 4 ontologies. So we created this ontology. Hopefully you can see my cursor. We created this ontology of conservation actions, but existing ontologies already exist for insects. And what I mean there is taxa. So lists of insect taxa are already available and we use those. Lists of different regions around the world are available. Regions, countries, continents. And then lists of different biomes that are described by the IUCN are also available in a dictionary. So we had 2 approaches. The first one was to identify which records in our big evidence base of 40,000 records explicitly mentioned some of the actions that we extracted, the regions that could be around the world, the biomes that we had described, and particular insect species. And so we explicitly identified some of the articles that clearly included those words. But as anybody who's been performing some searches would understand, there are many articles that would include certain conservation actions, but not describe them in exactly the same words that we've used in our ontology. So the second stage was to perform some topic modeling, and that unsupervised topic modeling allowed clusters of articles to appear based on terms that appeared within each abstract. So you might have a cluster that contains certain words that relate to, for example, aquatic conservation, or words that relate to a particular region like Africa. It's not immediately obvious what those topics necessarily mean, what those clusters necessarily mean. But what we were able to do was, if we found one cluster that had a large number of tags from the dictionary method for a particular conservation action, we could, with some reliability, say this cluster of topics this cluster of papers is likely to be around that conservation action. So in this way, together, we were able to identify clusters of papers that were using certain actions, even if they didn't explicitly mention them. So that's the technical side over. I'll move on to the results. So in terms of where our conservation actions were studied across the world, you can see here that there's a substantial bias, again, as we had for the experts, in fact, towards the US. And you'll notice this is a log scale on the right. So we got a lot more research from the United States than we did anywhere else. We also had a lot from the UK. And then everything from everywhere else was more similar in terms of the number of studies per region. And in terms of the number of actions that were most frequently studied, we split them across these 6 domains. So they were land and water management actions, actions that related to livelihoods, economics, or other incentives, species management, land or water protection, law and policy, and education and awareness. And I'll run through each of those one by one. So for land and water management, you can see that there was a huge amount of research on pesticide reduction. So a lot of the research that we found was around not using pesticides and the benefit that that would have on insects. But there's still a large amount of work on other management activities. In terms of livelihoods, there was quite a lot on payment for ecosystem services, and then very little on a small number of other categories. In terms of species management, which differs from land or water management, you can see that there was a fair amount on conservation below the species level. So we mean management of populations, for example, and a number of other categories there. For land and water protection, there was a smaller number of studies on things like mandating long-term monitoring of protected areas using indicator species and buffer zones around areas occupied by conservation species. And there were so few studies on law and policy and education and awareness that they weren't really categorizable below that level. But this is one of our main findings, that there was very little on the human aspect of insect conservation in terms of livelihoods, economics, incentives, law and policy, or education and awareness. In terms of taxa that were studied, we found a huge amounts of research on Lepidoptera, on butterflies, on Coleoptera, on beetles, Hemiptera, Diptera, and Hymenoptera, and then less on some of the other taxa. Eliza also generated an over-study metric. So what this metric does is it takes account of the species richness of each taxa and then compares the level of research attention relative to its species richness. So interestingly, Phasmida and Lepidoptera are very well studied, but then Plecoptera, Mecoptera, and Embioptera, for example, are much less frequently studied when you take account of the number of species that there are. So that was quite an interesting metric as well. In terms of the habitats that were studied, it was primarily in forest and artificial terrestrial habitat, and the vast majority of that artificial terrestrial was agriculture. And you can see here, sorry, I just have to move my video, how there is a cross-tabulation of the insect taxa down the y-axis here in this heat map, versus the habitat type. So the darker the color, the more studies there were. And so Lepidoptera studied in farmland and Coleoptera studied in farmland and forest were very well studied, whereas the white areas and lighter colored areas were much less frequently studied. So beetles in shrubland was infrequently studied, for example. So by comparing within each row and within each column, you can see some of the areas that are better or poorer studied. And then this shows the conservation actions, and here we've colored them by the general type of action. So down the right-hand side, you can see those groups that I mentioned before: habitat protection, habitat management, land and species management, etc. And you can see some of the main subcategories. We have multiple levels of actions here, but you can see some of the main subcategories here. And this is separated in this slide across insect taxa. So you can see that reducing pesticides was very common in Hymenoptera, Hemiptera, and Lepidoptera, I think. There's something over my screen at the top, and in Coleoptera. So that's what we might expect. And you can see some of the other gaps and clusters as I described in the heat map for the previous slide as well. And then which habitats were studied by action. So again, this is the same actions down the right-hand side, but instead of having insect taxa, we've got habitat now in this heat map. And you can see that the vast majority of evidence here was for artificial terrestrial habitats and reducing pesticides. So a lot of the conservation actions were around reducing pesticides or halting pesticide use in farmland in particular. So that was a very whistle-stop tour of the results. But some of the other outputs that we've produced, as I think will be circulated later on, is a report that explains both the methods that we have undertaken and the results that I've presented, but some more results as well. But what we really wanted to show, because there are lots of different ways of looking at this data, there are 4 different ontologies. There's region, biome, action, and insect taxa. It's helpful to be able to play around with the data and see what's there. in an interactive way. So to that effect, we've produced a website, insectconservation.github.io, and you can play around, you can interact with the results on that website there. And then finally, the other output that I wanted to highlight is the R package topic tagger. So if any of you are familiar with using R, that is functioning and available on GitHub. And the beauty of this is that if you have an ontology, like a dictionary of different actions or regions or chemicals or something, anything you want to apply, you can replicate this. You just have your starting studies, you have your dictionaries, and you just apply them, but using the script that Eliza has already developed. So it's a very replicable process. Yeah, and thanks very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Neal. There were many details you presented, and as you said, you can go to the website you presented and the report, and both of them. There should be links on our website, but we will also make sure that you get these links after the webinar.
I was just showing the website here, so I followed the link to the
Okay.
website and gone to the results, and you can see that there's, in particular, that each one is described separately, but then you can also explore the heat maps and see those in more detail at several different layers.
I had a more general question to you, Neal. Was it anything that struck you or surprised you when you did the analysis and wrote the report?
Yes, I think I'm not sure I would say I was surprised, because this is very common in conservation that there's a heavy bias towards the Western hemisphere and the Northern hemisphere, but the global North in particular. I was really surprised by how much research there was from the US and the UK. And I think a lot of what was in the evidence base was farmland ecology and insects and conservation, which is like to be expected, I suppose.
And that is not a language issue, that it's mostly English-speaking countries?
Yeah, I think one of the really important things in systematic reviews and systematic maps is that you account for data in other languages, as you say. And I think there will be a lot from South America that would be in Spanish and Portuguese. There would be a lot from Africa that could be in French or other languages, for example. And China as well is a sort of fairly impenetrable evidence base, but I think language could be an issue. And because we only search for grey literature, that could be a problem. Although the bibliographic databases that we searched as part of the Entergem project, which formed the evidence in this project as well, does catalogue non-English language research with English abstracts. So there will be some evidence in our database that is not English.
Okay.
But yeah, it's a good point.
Yeah.
I think the other finding that I was really surprised by was how little there is in terms of research around not whether interventions work to conserve insects, but whether they are applicable in practice. Like, what's the acceptance of an intervention? What's people's willingness to pay for insect conservation? What insect conservation actions have been conducted around education or those kind of things? And there was just very, very little. I was very surprised by that.
Well, that's interesting and something to remember, and maybe we can discuss it later. Then thank you very much, Neal. We move on now to our Swedish experts. And first, Magnus, can you turn on your camera? Hello. You're a research analyst at Formas, the Swedish Research Council on Environment and Agriculture, something like that. And you work with evidence synthesis and systematic reviews. You're very experienced in doing this type of systematic reviews since you worked for many years in the Mistra-funded project EVM, which is the Mistra, or was the Mistra Council for Evidence-Based Environmental Management before you came to Formas. Please, Magnus, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, I read this report with great interest, and I think that the tool Neal presented here seems to be very useful. Firstly, it's useful for me as a way to get a structured overview of published literature within a particular field, and that can be very helpful in the early stages of a systematic mapping project, which I am from now and then involved in. And secondly, it's also useful, as Neal said, as a way to identify research gap. And these two areas of use is of course a double benefit for an organization like Formas, where we both conduct systematic evidence reviews and we fund primary research, and therefore we need to know where research is needed. So for us, I think this can be a quite useful tool. With respect to the last point here, I said we need to know where research is needed. I should perhaps stress that a research gap is not necessarily the same thing as a true research need, which Neal also said here, and that there may be very good reasons why a particular research question has been neglected by the scientific community. And to identify true research needs, it's important to also involve stakeholders and listen to their needs, and also to involve subject experts and listen to their knowledge on a particular issue. And I think that's also clearly pointed out in this InsectGapMap report. So that's a very good thing about this report. One interesting finding in this report I found is this lack of research related to human aspects in this area, which Neal also pointed out in this presentation. I'm not sure how much of this lack of, or apparent lack of research depends on the choice of literature databases when searching for literature. It seems to have been a very comprehensive search, so maybe also research in social sciences have been covered in. You have used literature databases that cover that kind of research. But anyway, if it's if this lack of research is true, I think it's quite an important finding, and it definitely sends a signal to us at Formas as a research funding agency. I also noted that Sweden appeared as a white spot on the world map you showed at the presentation, which indicates that this has not been a prioritized research field in Sweden. I'm not an insect expert, so I don't know if this is true. It might be this language issue that you talked about, but anyway, I found it a bit alarming, and it definitely deserves to be followed up, and we should try to find out what the reasons for this may be. And finally, I also just wanted to add that I think it's really good that this tool is an open source R package, so that anyone who is interested in this can use it. So thank you for that. And that's my main comment on this report. I think it was really interesting, and the tool seems promising.
Thank you, Magnus. Just to follow up, and with your experience, do you have any thoughts or ideas how this tool or methodology that have been used in the study could be improved? When we spoke before the meeting, you mentioned other analysis you've been involved in, one on the Baltic Sea.
Yes, well, I was quite recently, I was involved in a project where we were asked to do a quick mapping exercise to get an overview of the published literature on effects of climate change on ecosystems in the Baltic Sea. And in that project, we were primarily interested in studied outcome measures and what species had been studied in those studies. And you mentioned in the report, you mentioned that this topic tagger with a topic tagger, that tool can be used to extract that kind of information and tag studies with those labels. So I was a bit interested to know how much further development is needed of this tool to be able to extract that kind of information. Is it sufficient to just develop this new ontology for that, or do you need to also adjust the coding in this topic tagger? And also it would be quite interesting to let the topic tagger do this analysis and then compare the results with the results that we obtained when doing this manually.
Yeah, thank you for your answer. I could see that you took notes, Neal, and you can comment on that when we after the presentations of the other two experts. And so keep this in mind. Then I turn to Marie Stensecke. Marie is professor in human geography at the University of Gothenburg. In her research, she deals with biodiversity, nature protection, landscapes, and outdoor recreation with a social science perspective. She is or has been a member of many panels and boards, also outside academia. She is currently co-chair of the multidisciplinary expert panel of IPBES, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. Please, Marie, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to reading and learning something about insects. So I take the social science perspective, since that was kind of an open question, I would say, in the report. And I'm thankful to Neal and the company for being very transparent and this gap that you detected. You also ask in the kind of in the report or note that there's a lack of research on the broader theory of change. And then coming back to what is the knowledge gap when it comes to social science, and I would say humanities as well, as I guess you have found very little of. Is there really a lack of knowledge? Or is there a lack of interdisciplinary research teams? You kind of, you raise both issues. I'm not sure where you kind of decide what it is, but I'm glad you point out at kind of these both. I would go for the latter one, and I can explain a bit more why. I'm impressed by the methods and the thorough work you've been doing, and I kind of have no really comments on that. It sounds very trustful. It looks very trustful to me. Though looking for social science humanities research, I say that this method works well for natural science, but there would be much more need for other methods for capturing the social science that could be relevant for these fields of research. And I say this also since I know that this is not just about insects, but also how do we kind of find the knowledge gaps within biodiversity. And I would say that it's kind of based on there are really bigger differences between the two strands of kind of, you say, research, natural science research, and research on the human dimension that is often presumed in this kind of work. And so it's kind of nothing wrong with the methods, but it might need to have another study to capture them. this probably, I would say, not one size fits all in this sense. I say natural science bias because what you drive or look into ontology is taxa, biomes, regions, conservation activities, which is not necessarily or quite seldom the kind of in focus for social science humanities research. And you could also say who had done the research and kind of captured these third terms. Often is it kind of suggested by those that don't have the background in theories, approaches, and methods within social science humanities. So, and added to that, if you look at social science research that are of relevance and would be fruitful here, I would say that the large bulk of it doesn't have insects in their kind of buzzwords or keywords or titles, or probably not even anywhere in their in the text. And just to illustrate kind of the difference, and this I picked from Hagmark's Mistra, my own old experience from Mistra. I have a more recent one, but this was maybe my only slide I have where I have even insects on. You see bonden en nyckelaktör? Yeah. So in Hagmark's Mistra, we did research on semi-natural grasslands and looked at kind of the species richness there, a number of us, my ecological colleagues, and we saw that kind of grazing animals were key. That was since we looked at the semi-natural pastures, because their use of the lands paved the way for a good the flora, which attracted insects, and then that attracted predators and birds and so on. And that kind of the logic of the ecology. But you need farmers to keep the animals, and this is from a Swedish perspective. And what keeps the farmers going and attracts them to be here? Well, it's schools for the kids, there are roads to make kind of often there are commutings in the families, knowledge, good healthcare, that is a good yield of the businesses, the shops around, that the authorities are kind of decent and the stable conditions for the economy of the farms, and also some kind of appreciation of society at large. And these aspects you could study and kind of end up with that's good for keeping farming, and that is indirectly then good for insects. But it doesn't necessarily have to address insects itself when you kind of look at this holistic life perspective. So I'd say what human social science humanities look at is life forms, or if you look into the developing country, you could say livelihoods. It's more about survival. And some colleagues have called it's kind of about foreground and background. And the insects are not in the foreground in social science research. There's not a lack of research on governance, behavior, ethics, communication, power relation, pedagogy in social science. I wouldn't say that we have enough of it, so it's just to kind of piggyback on. But there is a lot out there that could be very useful for the issues that you address for this theory of change. So that is one kind of the on social science perspectives in it. Added to that, when you look at the life form or livelihoods, of course, you could just think of our own lives. It's kind of a complex world we're living in. We are taking care of the kids. We want to have close to shopping, outdoor recreation, whatever. And so it's not just insects in focus or the land use in focus, even for the farmers. There are other activities as shown. Added to that is all the complexities of sustainable development. If I think as a sustainability research in social science. So if we're there is a sentence there in a report saying, so how do we make people care about insects? Well, the tricky issue is, of course, that we should also care about all the other species, animals, the flora, the climate, the other 15, 16 SDGs, which address various things. And that's another reason why you kind of from a behavior perspective. We're looking how should we do. Maybe it's not even ethical just to say how should we do to save the insects. Well, we need to minimize our imprints or maximize the possibilities of sustainability goals as a whole, which is of course very challenging in itself. We cannot bring everything into the picture all the time. But coming back to the theories of change, yes, I think that is a good starting point. How do we reach it? And I think this theories of change and the call for transformative change also calls for transformation of science. And I come back to kind of old sayings in social science humanities when we look at the environment. I think it's good to realize we cannot kind of invite social sciences to predefined boxes or pre-formulated problems. But I guess coming with your study as you have been done, and this is the insect situation, or applying to another field of research, and then more kind of without deciding what should be the answer, say, so how could this be addressed? Maybe have another group of experts looking into it and say, and identify various fields of research, and maybe combining with other kinds of then sustainability aspects than just insects. I guess that could be a fruitful way forward to kind of finding interesting research and relevant and high, very qualitative research. And I'd say Mistra, this is nothing. What I say is particularly new, certainly not in Mistra, where there is a tradition of promoting interdisciplinarity. And maybe we should be better on building on what we already have learned in Hagmarks Mistra, Fjäll Mistra, Vastra, not to say the least, because I think that was maybe one. And all these are quite old, and still seems that we are, we might do better to build on the experience we already have in this kind of integrating natural science and social science. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Marie. Very valuable comments, I think, and you bring in another perspective and other insights, which I think we need. Also, very good that you mentioned other former Mistra programs that, of course, we can build on, and that there is much research and knowledge already there that we can use. So, but I think we move on with our last speaker, Per Sjögren-Gulve.
Hello.
Hello. Per, you're a principal research officer at Naturvårdsverket, or the Swedish EPA in English, and specializes in communicating science-based knowledge for biodiversity conservation and wildlife management. You're a member of the Society for Conservation Biology and member of 2 IUCN specialist groups. You were, before you came to the Swedish EPA, you were associate professor in conservation biology at Uppsala University. You're a specialist in population viability analysis and has been member of the EU ad hoc expert group on application of favorable reference values in the status reporting associated with the Habitats Directive. Please, Per.
So I was asked by Thomas to review this report, and I have done it from my personal, in my personal capacity. So it's from my experience and from my view, and I'm not Naturvårdsverket in this. I'm the expert I am. And so I think that these results are very, very interesting. I think it's a useful approach because if you are looking for gaps, I think that it might suffice with kind of monitoring the titles and the abstracts of the papers. If you are looking for other things, I think you would maybe need to look in greater detail also into the discussion and conclusions of papers. Because not all will be in the abstract paragraph. But I think that these results can also be generalized to a lot of living organisms, not just pollinators. And I will get into this and discuss this a little bit because I think it's very important, and it also opens up to a very great extent to social sciences and multidisciplinary research. Let's see if I can get this going. My emphasis in a way is systems analysis and program theory, and this is used in evaluation of interventions in order to achieve objectives or targets. And what can be seen if we are looking at biodiversity conservation, but many other things, is that we have agreed maybe on objectives and targets. For instance, in Sweden, the Parliament's environmental objectives, targets of the EU Commission or the biodiversity strategy. And then it comes to have strategies and interventions, activities. And these are under great influence from a number of things. But usually when you say, okay, what shall be done, then you arrive at the productivity measures. And that is like, how many hectares of land shall we protect? But the thing is really that very often you do not look at the effect in specific. You kind of settle for some easy targets or easier targets that are the productivity measures that you have said, okay, but we've saved this amount of forest without having a specific look on what are the effects actually. So I want to get back to this. And this can create something that might not be so very efficient for the conservation of, for instance, pollinators. So I want to get into this thing, and this is really multidisciplinarity. We have objectives that are not achieved. There is a lack of implementation, and this lack of implementation has been made for a number of things, like the 6th and 7th environmental action programs of the EU. It's also been said with respect to whether or not the habitats and birds directives were fit for purpose. They were, but the implementation was far too weak. We also have the same thing, genomförande underskott in the Sveriges miljömål, the Sweden's environmental objectives set by the parliament. And the CBD HE targets in the Global Biodiversity Outlook #5, it's very clear that implementation was very bad. And why is this? Well, one component is, of course, ignorance. Might be arrogance too, but definitely varying degrees of ignorance, and that there is insufficient science-based knowledge. There is also this thing about simplicity. Guidelines or policies often take into account that this needs to be simple, because otherwise people will not understand. And in this, it might be also that this kind of collaboration between specialists, scientists as one component, and the collaborative learning when you work with this might be impaired, and then you get effects that are not as good as you would like. But if you don't measure the effects and you go for the productivity instead, then it will be that you might have another look, that it looks better than it in fact is when you measure the effects. And another aspect of this is also costs. So measuring productivity, which is easier, or measuring effects. So we come back to this thing that what is most costly? I'll leave it to you. And then, of course, in this overall systems theory and analysis, of course, there are different opinions and agendas, and there might be conflicts of interest. And here you see a variety of very, very interesting subject areas for research and follow-up also multidisciplinarily, and especially, of course, in social sciences. a final thing that I would like to just point out is also the importance of the landscape, that it can be, for instance, regarding pollinators, that of course we think about their food, there are pollinators, maybe that they have shelter and hibernation sites, and these two relate to the survival of individuals of the various species. But usually it can be that also other aspects are forgotten. So for instance, where do they reproduce? So it might be that you have a landscape that is full of food, but when they are supposed to reproduce, they don't have anywhere to go. And the other aspect of this is, of course, also the connectivity in the landscape. So can the individuals of one species find all these three life important things in the landscape? Or is connectivity so bad so that they cannot go to where they need to reproduce, or they are hindered to find food? So there are many aspects from what you have discovered, and I think that this used to kind of highlight gaps would be very, very useful. So I thank you for reviewing this and hope that these comments will also be some fruit for discussion with respect to the social science input. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Per. One thing that, yeah, in a way you mentioned, and but also Magnus, or I think it was, had a question about a map that you showed, Neal, where it was white in Sweden when you could see where you had used conservation action studies, or where these data came from. So more general question is then, if we, and now you can turn on your cameras, all panelists. A more general question then is, to what extent are the results of this study or the conclusions applicable for Europe or even for Sweden? They are based on a global database, you can say. But also now, Neal, if you want to comment on the things that have been mentioned and the comments you have had, and even questions, you can start maybe, and then we can take another round.
Sure, thanks so much. Thank you so much for the comments and the critiques. Really, really valuable, and I agree with all of your points entirely. On the apparent absence of evidence from Sweden, the figure is in log scale. So although it appears white, there may still be evidence, or there will still be evidence from Sweden, but it's in relation, the coloring in particular is in relation to the vast amount of evidence from the United States, which would be in tens of thousands of papers. So even if there were thousands of papers or hundreds of papers from Sweden, it would be shaded much more lightly. One thing we want to do moving forwards is take the interactivity one step forward, so that from the database you can actually highlight every study that was found and tagged as belonging to Sweden. I think in our report we say that around 80% of our 40,000 studies were successfully, in inverted commas, geographically tagged. There will be some studies that weren't, because as Per very rightly says, we're using abstracts and titles for information, and in many cases the geography isn't clear until looking at the full text. So segueing into your comment about improvements, there are a few areas for, as I said, iteratively improving this, and the beauty of this is that we can just improve it over time and train it. That we could improve the relevance of the information that we have. There are some studies in there that aren't actually looking at insect conservation actions explicitly or very clearly. So some degree of training in terms of teaching an algorithm what's relevant and what's not would help to improve the relevance of what we found. And then, as we talked about before, grey literature in other languages could be thrown in and the models reran to check what impact that had. It's very easy to apply another ontology. So if there was an ontology of outcome measures, it would be very easy to apply that on top and run that. And it will be really interesting. One of the things we really want to do, and we started doing, was to validate running these models on some EVM reviews to see how it compared with the human coding and analysis of articles in large systematic maps like the one on buffer strips. And one thing that we can do with some of the studies, but not all of them because of the computational power needed, would be to run it on full text, as you said, so we can obtain open access full text where possible and run the models to see how that might differ. I imagine there'd be a lot more contextual information on geography in method sections, for example. And we have been working on another package that aims to pull out full texts and separate those sections to make that easier. Yeah, so maybe that just sort of starts things off by talking about the Sweden issue, and about the databases. The point I'll say before I stay quiet. The databases we used were generic databases that are multidisciplinary, but there weren't many databases that were specific to agriculture or specific to forestry, or specific to Latin American forestry, for example. So once you get past the 8 to 10 or so multidisciplinary databases that systematic reviewers often search, there are hundreds of other very specific databases. In one project we worked in, they've highlighted, I think, around 14,000 different bibliographic databases that are available at the moment. So there are lots of other resources that could be used and are normally used in a systematic review, but this sort of quick and dirty scoping exercise doesn't really have scope to look at.
If we think a little bit more about what I mentioned about the applicability of this type of study on a more restricted geographical area like Sweden or Europe, Per and Marie, who have worked on conservation issues in Sweden, I think more concrete practical projects. Are these results useful in a Swedish context? Or are they too broad, too general? Anyone who wants to start? Per?
I think they are useful. I cannot see that Sweden or Scandinavia would be significantly different in that way. I'm not sure. Marie knows better than I with respect to social sciences. But I think both Sweden and Norway, for instance, and perhaps Finland too, are doing relevant research with respect to biodiversity conservation and from the social sciences viewpoint.
Yeah, if I choose to misinterpret your question, Thomas, then I'd say Swedish context. Well, Swedes, or us living in this country, make our biggest imprints of biodiversity outside our country through trade and through the consumption patterns we have that we import food and material and so on, which means that we need to take care of also those kind of negative effects our lifestyles does in the rest of the world. So if we're gonna look at kind of our impact of insects and from a Swedish perspective, I just think it would be fair to not miss out, or at least be clear that if we just look into the Swedish, what's happening with the insects in Sweden, we will be looking into a minor part of the insects that we are impacting with our lives.
Yeah, that's a fair comment. Then this distinction is not that relevant, of course, of whether it's Swedish or whether it's global, because we have an impact all over the world by our way of living. I think we have a few questions also that have come in the Q&A, and I then will ask my colleague Linda to join us also. Linda is also a programs director and has worked together with me preparing this this event and also with the study and the commission of the study. Are there any questions?
Thank you, Thomas. And I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank Neal and the other speakers for a very interesting discussion so far and a very interesting presentation. We do have some questions in the Q&A, and please add more questions if you have any. We have a few more minutes. But the first question, you may have already answered this, Neal, but it's about, if you're interested in a special region, say northern Sweden, are there more details on this in this review? And there is also another question. I might as well just take that right away. That the lack of targeting social science studies in this mapping also illustrates the difference between mapping knowledge gaps between drivers, producers, state, etc. So those are the two questions that I will hand over to you, Neal, at this time. If you want to.
Sure, thanks very much.
Thanks.
Yeah, so because we have 40,000 records, I initially wanted to be able to provide a level of interactivity that would allow people to dive in straight to the article to see, for example, which articles had been tagged as belonging to Sweden. Unfortunately, that level of interactivity when there are 40,000 records and each record has all of these tags for the 4 ontologies and the relationship between them is computationally very difficult to make publicly available on a website. So we're still working on that a little bit, but it should be at least easy to have some form of what we would call a choropleth, where at the country level you can see the number of studies and sort of move around. So that's very easy to produce and is on our to-do list to put into the interactivity on the website. But one of the things I would want to do before we let people sort of dive into the article level is to explore some additional training that we can do to improve the relevance of the 40,000 articles that are included. I think this gives a nice overview, but diving in too deep might give you a slightly misrepresentative answer. So it's, as we say, it's more about the overview and where there is a lack of studies rather than where they are with the scoping review. I think it's quite important not to give the implication that this kind of review is as rigorous as a systematic review or a systematic map. So that would be my only concern. But thank you very much for the compliment and the question. And then sorry.
The other question.
Yeah, the second question, sorry.
Yeah, the second question. Yeah. So just before I hand over to Marie, the second question, the difference between mapping knowledge gaps between pressures, drivers, and state.
Or you can head over to Marie if you want.
Yeah, I might pass this answer over because Marie is the expert.
Well, if I'm the expert, I mean, well, the dips here, that is a way of describing the connections between our actions and what happens and responses to that. And it is one perspective that is to some extent also contested from a social science humanities perspective, since it's a kind of a fairly instrumental way of looking into the human dimensions. So that is what I would answer to that. I mean, it's and related to that, I think that we might not just need to look at, I mean, it could be good to see what actions cause what impacts, but to change them, to find the driver change, we need to look also to the indirect drivers or the kind of what forms our actions and our the not very clear always relation between attitudes and behavior, or between knowledge and behavior that is even less kind of clear. We need to, as stated in the IPBES global assessment, when it kind of looks at what we need for kind of changes, also look into what we think are the values of life, or revisit how we interact with the rest of nature, and maybe reconsider what we think it's a good quality of life, and so on. So there are these expert things we could also bring into it. I mean, it should also be noted that in social science humanities, it's kind of a more diverse set of disciplines than I would say in natural science. So we there is, of course, valuable to have this payment for ecosystem services studies, but they need to be complemented with other views, more kind of qualitative perspectives on because they to give a broader picture and also to find this theories of change. So I think that is part of the problem at mapping the knowledge gaps. You cannot just put, of course, governance in there because you will have too many answers or on the list that you don't want. But if you put governance and insects, you will miss out a lot of interesting governance studies that would be valuable, but they might have, we talk about species general or natural resources or landscape and never had them insects in. So that is a challenge for, and I think therefore you need to work differently to capture and find interesting kind of platforms or interactions between different strands of science.
Thank you, Marie. And maybe what you're saying is that maybe we cannot just use this study when we are going to the next step to try to develop a call. We need also to integrate other ways of informing us about the needs and the gaps, maybe through discussion with other experts, not only this type of analysis. But Linda, then that brings me to what will happen now? What will we do from our side at Mistra?
Yes,
based on this study?
Exactly. What will happen now? So a very good question, Thomas.
Yes, and I hope you have a very clear answer.
Of course, yeah. So I think as you mentioned at the beginning of the seminar, and I think which is also stated on our website, this study was commissioned as part of our research initiation process in the field of biological diversity. And we have the board's decision to move forward this year with a call on this in this very broad topic. And so the idea behind this report and the study that Neal and Eliza with colleagues conducted was twofold actually. So first was to sort of try this methodology in terms of research funding. Would it be useful for us as a way of finding research gaps? But it was also as a part of the theme itself. But we will now take all of these results with us, and we will also look into the field of biological diversity from probably a few different angles before we move on. And I'd like to welcome all the participants of this seminar also to come up with ideas for the future work in this field. But I think today we've gained some very important insights. I'd like to especially thank the panelists and the authors of the study. But I think one important topic that came up was, of course, that Mistra as a research funder, we have a pretty important history also to look into to make sure that we actually follow up on our previous programs that actually came up with some very interesting conclusions in this field. And Marie mentioned several of them. We also have, of course, the Mistra ABM program, which in itself focus very much on conservation issues. So yes, we'll take it from there. But we value all of your input in this process. So please get in touch with Thomas or myself if you have ideas also. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. And it is time to end this webinar now. As Linda said, many thanks to the authors of the report, of course, and to our speakers today, Neal, Magnus, Marie, and Per. Thanks to you who asked questions, and thanks to all who have followed us. And let's keep in touch. If you have comments and so, you can email us, Linda or me. So thank you very much. That's all from us. Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.